Welcome to this another series of presentations where we're looking at what the Bible teaches in the 21st century. A world today that's very different in many ways from the world of the Bible, but in other ways very similar. The theme of this series of presentations is the Israel-Palestine problem. What does the Bible teach? How does it direct us? What insights does it give us when we're facing this problem? A problem that today is literally tearing nations apart and making the lives of many individual people and families miserable. The Israel-Palestine problem. There's a picture which includes the Middle East. The country that is known as Israel or Palestine is tiny, and yet it has posed so many problems over the years. Enlarging it, divided between two people groups. Israel, and then the Palestinians left with the area marked in green. But as Israel is building more and more settlements, encroaching on the West Bank and Gaza areas, the Palestinians are losing ground all the time and being driven out. Jerusalem, a city on the dividing line, a city that has many problems. The country is not large, and yet it is strategically placed, and it is being fought over ruthlessly today by two people groups backed by nations, very powerful nations, outside the area. And the damage that's done, we've seen these pictures on television. Armaments funded by the Americans, used by the Israelis to destroy Palestinian areas. But behind the scenes, what do we say to the man who's lost his home? What do we say to the people who are trying to get their friend to medical help and it's not there? Will this victim live or die? And how do we comfort the mother who's lost her son in a bombing raid? These are the grim realities of human tragedies that armaments and the use of armaments can cause and are causing today in that land. What is the truth? Just what is going on? A very perceptive comment made by somebody very experienced. And I'm inviting you to come with me to see if we can find the truth. It'll require a lot of effort, a lot of searching, and some of it will be very uncomfortable. But let's see if we can come with an open mind and find the truth. Some of it will be unpleasant. Mostly Palestinian deaths. Just think of these numbers. Refugees losing everything and their livelihoods and just living in the desert in tents and dependent on the handouts from others. And even today, how much suffering there is behind the scenes that doesn't hit our television screens very much. I want to try and see this in perspective. Not my perspective, but the perspective of evidence. Everything is ruthlessly based on evidence. The United States has a massive aid budget, and a high proportion of this budget has gone to Israel. Nothing has gone to Palestinians. The figure is eye-watering. That's a lot of money. Most of it goes in armaments. In recent years, $3,000 million a year for direct military aid to the Israelis, nothing to Palestinians. Break it down, it's a lot of millions per day, and it's even $95 a second. The USA gives massive amounts of aid all over the world, extremely generous. The United Kingdom total aid giving annually is about that figure in dollars. That's given for everything. Most of it nothing to do with armaments. The United Kingdom does quite well. In Europe, we're one of the highest givers in percentage terms, only some of the Scandinavian countries consistently coming above us. Indeed, at the world level, taking all aid, not just military aid, the United States gives the most. It is generous. Saudi Arabia is second, but there's a big difference. Saudi Arabia, with all its wealth, only gives to Islamic countries, except that it invests vast amounts of money building mosques in other countries. While at the same time, by law, in Saudi Arabia, nobody is allowed to build a church or a temple or even to meet in a group for any other religious occasion other than Islam. So let's put the United States in a bit of perspective in its giving. A lot of its giving is extremely generous, but its giving for military aid is one-sided, and it is huge when it comes to Israel. And we'll look later at why that is so. This is going to be 4 presentations. They are interlocked and interlinked. You may want to watch them one after the other, but that will take you perhaps 2.5, 3 hours. You may want to watch them separately. If you watch them in a group, you may want to watch them separately and then talk and discuss about some of the issues. There'll be things you will find uncomfortable, maybe surprising, disturbing. But it's all based on evidence. I am trying ruthlessly not to base it on my opinions, but to base it on evidence drawn from many sources. Evidence from academic studies, of which there are many. There's a lot of Jewish documented evidence. They keep good records. Christian Zionists, there are many statements and publications almost entirely from the United States, another source of evidence. But there also are Christian Palestinian sources. Palestinians who are Christians, who follow the Lord. And there are sources there. There's much evidence that comes from neutral sources with no political agenda and no religious agenda. There's a little bit of direct experience of my own. But I've been cautious about that because I could be biased. I'm going to draw on biblical scholarship, the best biblical scholarship that I can lay my hands on in these areas, as we try to understand what the Bible is saying about this problem. But I want you to note that there's a lack of Islamic evidence, partly because it's not there, and what may be there I haven't got access to. So there's a lack of the Islamic evidence, although I have got some. But it's based on evidence, and you will find, I'm almost certain, that the findings that I will present to you are uncomfortable. They may irritate you, you may disagree with them, but they are evidence, not opinion. And it may make you want to think again about the whole issue. I'm inviting you to come with me. We're given an awful lot of information through the media and through what we've heard. Some of it is not really true. I want you to weigh the evidence. Look at what I'm revealing, what I'm showing. It is drawn from good and reputable sources. Weigh that evidence. Think it through yourself. And towards the end, when we come to part 4, we'll look at things that we can do practically today to help a very difficult situation. Right, let's start and look at the historical background. What I'm going to do to this is to try and track in and trace in a broad brush term, the background that's led to the present situation. Some of it's biblical, much is just historical. Come with me because it will give you, I think, a hope, a background picture of what this problem is all about. If you like, from the days of the earliest biblical records throughout history, how did we get to where we are today? What is the source of the issues and the problems that we're facing today? I'm going to give you a lot of information. Way back 4,000 years ago, broadly speaking, 2 empires were involved in the area that's today known as Israel-Palestine. The Hittite Empire based in Turkey, the Egyptian Empire based in the Egyptian area. The land was occupied by very small tribal people groups, was fairly empty, sometimes called Canaanites, sometimes called Amorites. And they were usually ruled by either the Hittites or the Egyptians. By about the 13th century, after the day when Joshua had brought the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, into the land, the Hittite and Egyptian empires were still there, but the Hittite Empire had been moved back and Egypt had taken a bit more control. But Israel, under Joshua, had taken over the land, sort of. But after his death, it was pretty disunited. It came together under 3 consecutive kings, powerful kings, Saul, his son-in-law David, and David's son Solomon. And it became a united Israel for quite a period of time. And the land was kind of consolidated, organized, and put in motion in an organized way. But then after the death of Solomon, it split. The northern part became known as Israel, the southern part became known as Judah. The northern part was overrun by the Assyrians in 721, and the population deported and replaced. By 586, the Babylonian Empire overran the southern part, Judah, and deported most of the cream of the population to live in the Babylon area. And they moved other people groups in, so the population was now really quite mixed up. The Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, and they allowed the Jews to return from Babylon. Some did, many didn't. But they didn't really have freedom because they were still under other cultures and empires. The Greeks conquered the Persians, and they made the area kind of vassal state, but it absorbed a lot of Greek culture, and the Greek language became the dominant language of the entire area and all the surrounding areas. For a short period of time, there was a kind of Jewish rule, but much of it was corrupt. And the country became kind of divided. And then the Romans came in. They conquered the land, took it over, and made it a Roman province. We're now in the time of Jesus. AD 70, about 40 years after Jesus was crucified and resurrected. The Romans got fed up with the Jewish behavior, and they sacked the entire country, destroyed Jerusalem, and demolished the temple block by block, just as Jesus had prophesied and predicted. Later in AD 135 there was a further Roman incursion, and a pagan temple was set up on the temple site, and Jews were banished from the land. Christianity was growing. And the Byzantine Empire, the eastern part of Christianity, was now dominant in the land. And this involved a lot of Christian building at the time. Until 2 years after, or a few years after the death of the Prophet, Islam moved in. Caliph Omar took over, but in general, there was religious freedom for Jews and for Christians in the area. And this is a point where we should be ashamed. The West, the Crusades, and when they conquered Jerusalem, they killed the entire population there, Jew and Muslim. It was absolute brutality, and it stands in contrast to what the Muslims had done, which was much gentler. Islam took it back over under Saladin, and it became relatively peaceful. There was a measure of tolerance, but only so far. It came back under Egyptian rule, and Egypt used it as a kind of buffer state. There was religious freedom up to a point, but under Egypt there was a total neglect of the land, and things kind of slipped back culturally. Till in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, now that came from Turkey. We're back to the old Turkey-Egypt battle where we started 4,000 years ago. And the huge Ottoman Empire took it over, broadly Islamic, but not very dogmatic, a fair amount of religious freedom up to a point, And towards the end of the 19th century, there was the beginnings of Jews returning, mainly from the area that's broadly Russia today. After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire had worked with Germany. They lost. All their possessions were taken from them. Britain took the mandate for this area, amongst other countries round about. And the British mandate tried to get coexistence between the growing Jewish population and the Palestinian population that was there. But the rate of Jewish migration made this very difficult, and Britain eventually gave up and passed it to the United Nations. A lot of wars have taken place in recent years. In 1948, the Jews just took it over, and a massive disruption of Palestinian life followed immediately. And many Palestinians were driven out of the land, and once they were out, the borders were closed. They could not get back, even to land that they possessed and had legal entitlement to. Again, Israel, with its much more powerful armaments supplied by America, preemptive strike, better organization, they took over Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank and Golan in the north. Another massive exodus of Arab Palestinians. The borders closed, they couldn't get back. Russia decided to come in, so they started to arm Syria and Egypt, the countries on each side. So the Americans started to rearm Israel again. So we have a proxy war. But what the Americans were able to do really well was provide the intelligence, so the Israelis knew exactly what the opposition were doing and where. As a result, Syria and Egypt were defeated. President Sadat of Egypt agreed to a peace treaty, but those in the Islamic world arranged for him to be assassinated as a result. They didn't want peace. Further skirmishes went on. Palestine Liberation Organization refugee camps in southern Lebanon were continually attacked by the Israelis, largely because from these camps were being lobbed missiles. So the Lebanese were forced to drive the PLO out of their country just to get peace for themselves. And the PLO then re-established themselves in Tunisia. A whole series of uprisings. There's the first one. Poorly armed Palestinian street protesters. They were brutally suppressed. Destruction of homes, imprisonment, torture. The world press watched, but the world did nothing. During that time, the United Nations more or less recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Now, in the Gulf War, the Palestinians sided with Saddam Hussein, and as a result, they lost all credibility. It had an interesting effect, but very sad effect. In Kuwait, 10% of the population were Palestinians who'd fled from Palestine, had settled there. When the Palestinians sided with Saddam Hussein, the Kuwaitis understandably said, out. They were driven out into poverty and ended up mainly in Jordan. Negotiations went on. It nearly got to peace at the Oslo Accord in 1993. There was a beginning of withdrawal, but Israel kept on developing settlements in Palestinian areas, and it increased in size and growth. And these settlements were being linked up by road systems and networks. As a result, the Palestinian communities in their own areas were being marginalized and scattered and divided up. Border checks made life impossible. The Camp David talks, they broke up in disarray. The so-called Israeli offers effectively would have destroyed any possibility of a Palestinian state, because they would lose control over water, which is so critical, or their borders or airspace. But the Israelis had wonderful media management, and the world then blamed the Palestinians. And from then on it has gone on. Another uprising. Even more death toll. Butchery and savagery, and the Palestinians suffered more. A difficult and unpleasant history. The question is, who does own the land? Who has got rights to it? Now that's just a picture of what it is in history. The Canaanite population perhaps ruled the land for 1,000 years, but they weren't a nation. They were scattered people groups, and really they were under Egypt or Hittite empire control, but at a big distance. Overall, there's been a kind of Jewish-Israeli rulership of the land for 32% of the time span. Short period of Christian rule under the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and a long period of Islamic rule. So who does own the land? It's not clear. If you go back to the beginnings, really it should be owned half by the Hittites and the Egyptians if you think that age gives you precedence. But that would be illogical today. Let's move forward. We're seeing some of the events again from a different perspective. In AD 70, following a 4-year war, the Romans sacked the land. It was one of their most, if not the most, brutal campaign they'd ever conducted. Male Jewish population were simply crucified, simply for being men and being Jewish. Hundreds of thousands died in torture all along the roads around the country. The whole population was brutalized, women and children brutalized beyond belief. The Byzantine Empire, it gave a measure of peace and security to the area. Islam took over. Now, though there was religious freedom of a sort, I said, the population started to convert to Islam for a very good reason. Under Islam, if you're not Muslim, you suffer social disadvantages with regard to tax and job opportunities. So if you want to have a better lifestyle, you become a Muslim. It's a clever way to get conversions. That was a dreadful episode in history. We should be ashamed of what was done in the name of Christianity. Islam took over back to the Egyptian buffer state. And then the long period of Ottoman rule. If anyone owns the land in recent times, it's the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey. And they did bring in the developments, and many of the buildings and building sites today derive much from the Ottoman Empire. Now we move to 1917. An act went through the Parliament in London called the Balfour Act, named after the person who took it through. And it paved the way for a Jewish state. We'll look at that in a moment. After the First World War, the Peace Conference carved up the Middle East and gave roughly half to France and half to Britain. In doing so, it ignored commitments and promises that had been made to the Arab peoples who were scattered, disorganized under the Ottoman Empire, but promises made to them during the war. Again, to our shame. A two-state solution was proposed to try and resolve the problem of two populations fighting over the land. And in 1947, when the United Nations took it over, back over from Britain, they brought a specific plan, but when you look at it with hindsight, it was obviously never going to work. It was driven through under American pressure. When it came to 1948, the Jews just took it over. And they kept it using American armaments. And it just kept growing with more building, and the Palestinians lost more ground. There was some agreement with Egypt, and Egypt got the Sinai Peninsula back. Palestinians given the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but settlement building for Jews kept on growing. And the Palestinians had no real autonomy. They were really slaves in their own land. All sorts of peace conferences were held, but they nearly always collapsed. What Israel wanted was the Palestinians to recognize the right of Israel to exist. But there were enough Palestinian extremists firing rockets and suicide bombers. But at the same time, Israel never kept its bargain, and it kept on its building activities. And that, coupled by the reaction of terrorism from the Palestinian side, it never allowed progress to be made. And then who was going to look after Jerusalem? A sacred city for Islam and a sacred city for the Jews. There was no answer. It's been a hard-going story to make sense of this. Now there is the statement from the Balfour Act. Let me read it to you. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now it only takes a moment or two's thought to realise that that declaration has a built-in contradiction in it. You cannot establish a national homeland for Jewish people in Palestine without prejudicing the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. It's an impossibility. How did that act ever come to be passed? How did it ever get through? It goes back to this important man, Weizmann. He had moved from the continent to take up a lectureship in Manchester University in 1904. He was a high-quality scientist. His MP was Arthur Balfour. He wanted the land for Jews. There was a Zionist movement throughout Europe, West and East. He influenced his MP. Directly and indirectly, they influenced the Prime Minister. And at the time of the First World War, the idea of the Ottoman Empire being against it, because the Ottoman Empire was supportive of Germany. Weizmann was a leading scientist, and in due course he founded this World Centre, World Quality Research. The Weizmann Institute, still there today, doing amazing work. Because Weizmann realized that scientific research moves a nation forward, and it is always true. Why is it that the West so often has led the world in the last 100 years? Because science, modern science, developed in the Western world, and it has moved things forward. A major contributing factor. He eventually became the first president. He is an influential figure. But he had no regard for Palestinians. They shouldn't be on the land in his view. It was our land as of right. He didn't recognize them even as a national group. And in a sense he was right. The Palestinians were a disparate group of people, and they were part of the Ottoman Empire. All the Arab countries at that time were ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and they were just disparate groups. They were not organized into nation states in the way they are today. And he just saw the Palestinians don't belong there. Push them back over into Jordan. After all, that's part of the Ottoman Empire as well. So, by this activity, and by this declaration that was made, the basis was laid for an inevitable conflict with two people groups fighting over the same small piece of land. Britain eventually opted out and gave up. United Nations were brought in. They put up a proposal in 1947 to carve up the land between the two nations. Now look at the middle two boxes. This was before 1948, before Israel was formed. Look at how things were like then. The Arabs, 69% of the population, 94% of the land, they were given 48%. The Jews, 31% of the population, 6% of the land. They were given 52% of the land. It is not surprising that the Arabs who lived in the area, who were both Muslim and Christian, were not very happy with this proposal. I want to look at this Christian population for a moment, because another sad piece of history. The figures are not available for the whole land, but for Jerusalem itself. In 1922, just after the First World War, that's the recorded number of Christians in Jerusalem. Just over half of the population. Amazing. What happened to them? By 1978, the numbers had fallen. Now they're only 10% of the Palestinians, and there were lots of Jews there as well. By 2000, it's down to a tiny minority, less than 4% of Palestinians. Why did they go? Two reasons. The first reason was that the Israelis did not recognize Christian Palestinians. They just assumed they were all Muslims. So they got no favors whatsoever. They suffered just as much as the Islamic-based Palestinian peoples. But the Christians in general were more educated than their Muslim Palestinian friends. And therefore, they could move out because they could take up jobs overseas. They didn't want to, but they could do it. They were better educated. Despite the protestations to the contrary from Islam, Christianity has brought education to the world, not Islam. But there's a second reason. Christians, particularly in America, backed the Jewish takeover of the land. Therefore, the Palestinian Muslims associated Christianity as being pro-Jewish, even though the Jews didn't even recognize them. And so Muslim Palestinians made life miserable for Christian Palestinians. And they were driven out. And that pattern has happened and gone on till we're now left with most of the Christians of the Palestinian area have been driven out over 100 years. For a variety of reasons. It's a sad piece of history. That's what the estimate is over the period of time. Because they were educated, some have made successes. But others have been driven out, persecuted, their businesses burnt down, families threatened by Muslims who identified the Christian Palestinians as pro-Jewish, even though they were not. And the Jews didn't even recognize them. Many people have suffered. What are some of the issues? Anti-Semitism, Zionism, the Jews must have the land back. Then Christian Zionism, Christian groups, particularly in America, who believe the Jews have the right of the land. Britain had a major role. So did the United Nations. And so did and does America today, probably the dominant role today. But the Russians have been involved, supplying armaments as well. Arab nations round about, what's their reactions been? Palestinian voices, so often ignored. But they're the ones who've suffered worst. And what do the Jews think? Because they don't all think the same thing. I think we have to recognize with honesty that anti-Semitism, the persecution of Jews, has been generated by Christians down through the centuries. And it was encouraged by some of the great reforming leaders of the 16th century. And it became quite dominant in Eastern Europe for a while too. We have been responsible for this, and we should be ashamed. there are many Jews who have a clear, consistent view. The land is ours, God gave it, the Palestinians shouldn't be there, they should get out. And they have been supported by Christians, particularly in the United States, who say the land belongs to Israel by right, and that the Jewish return is part of a predetermined part of God's plan for the end times. We'll look at the Bible teaching on that later on in this series of presentations. I have to say, British policy has ranged from naivety, going back to the Balfour Act, to a complete lack of integrity, where promises were broken in the early 1920s. And we have contributed to much of the problem today by dabbling in wars in the Middle East. Sometimes doing a lot more than dabbling. United Nations has been weak. You see, there's been intense United States pressure. And that has pushed through because the United States has been able to apply pressure to other nations to whom United States has been giving overseas aid. And without that aid, these other poorer nations wouldn't survive. The United States has used that as a lever to force people to vote for things that have had unfortunate consequences. And the United States, it's dominated by a Jewish lobby and a Christian Zionist lobby, and that has allowed it to finance Israel on this enormous scale that we saw before. But oil comes in at times, and therefore selling arms to other Arab states in exchange for oil. Both the West and the East have been guilty of this. As the Jewish power has grown, Arab reactions have become from a desire to resist to eventually minorities are exerting violence. And the Palestinian voices, well, they've been disunited. They're still disunited. There are those who are willing to accept a two-state solution just for the sake of peace, while there are others who want the Jews just driven into the Mediterranean. And there's been a lack of unity there. Jewish views are diverse, but they all share this idea of a national identity around a religious label. But the attitude towards the Palestinians does vary. But the dominant voice and the dominant political voice in Israel today is driving the Palestinians out. The land is ours. They've no right to be there. It's a very complex and diverse situation today. It's not going to be easy to solve. What does the Bible say about all of this? On the left is my picture of how I see the Bible. The Bible is a wonderful, wonderful picture of the way God has interacted with human beings, centered in the life and the person of Abraham and down through the centuries, culminating in all that Jesus came to do and to say and to be in his life, death and resurrection. The focus of the Bible, if you look at the right, is on Jesus himself. The Old Testament points towards it. Jesus fulfilled all the Old Testament stood for. And the remainder of the New Testament shows how the way of Jesus works out into life. There's the picture of the Bible. We must interpret the Bible by asking, when was it spoken? The Bible was spoken. In those days, most people could not read or write. It was spoken. Where was it spoken and to whom? And then why? Why did the authors, yes, inspired by the Holy Spirit, say what they said? And how would the original hearers have understood it? Because you see, when we look at it that way, we can see the significance for today. Humanity doesn't basically change. God certainly doesn't change. Cultures do. But the way God interacts with humanity has got relevance, direct relevance, for us today. But if we simply rip verses out of context and use them to support things that we've already decided are true, we can end up with danger. Go back and ask these questions, and we're going to do that later in this presentation, hopefully to get at what the Bible actually says. Not my opinion. Scholars help us in making sense of what the Bible actually says. A word of warning. We need to interpret the Old Testament through the eyes of the New. The New Testament makes sense of the Old, not the reverse. And the danger is that people are taking Old Testament passages, ripping them out of context, and ignoring how the New Testament sees them. It's a dangerous way of doing things. You've got to do that, and we're going to try and do that. And scholars throughout the world do this automatically. We've got to understand the Old Testament prophetic sayings in the light of how the New Testament interprets them. It makes sense of them. So carry these things in mind as we go through this series to make sense of what the Bible says, because the second and third parts look at the Old and the New Testament in a lot more detail. Just very superficially looking at this for the moment, that's where it starts. The Lord said to Abram, the old name for Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Abram was told to leave his country. He was going to travel effectively south into the land that we now know as the land of Israel-Palestine. He was going to be a great nation. At that time he didn't even have a child. But the thing is, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Just keep that in mind. The land didn't come into it particularly till a bit later in the same passage. When he got into the land, the Lord appeared to him at Shechem, which is in the center roughly, and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So that's the beginning of it. Later in the story of Genesis, God made a covenant with Abraham and said, "To your descendants I will give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." Now there weren't many people in the land, scattered groups eking out a living from the land. But Abram was given that promise. Roughly, that's the picture of the land. That's where it all starts. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will greatly increase your numbers. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come." It starts with God in control. God Almighty. Abram had to respond to God, a life direction response. Blameless does not mean sinless. It means a decision is taken by Abraham that he's going to live his life the way God wishes it. A response of life direction. And a covenant was set up. Now this is a relationship between mankind and God, started through Abraham. God sets it up, but he sets the conditions. And the conditions of the covenant is that human response, by choice, we all have to take the decision. And it's a lifestyle commitment to say, I will live my life God's way. I will seek his way and purpose. That's what a covenant means. And there will be growth. Can't take over the land unless you've got numbers. Abram's little family was just a small group, nomadic people wandering in the land. And here was the security. for this wandering nomad, with his flocks and possessions, with his servants, with his wife, and a spiritual protection and security. God was going to go with them. That's God's, as it were, side of the bargain, the covenant. But the response from Abraham, keep my covenant. We've got to recognize that none of us can earn God's blessing. You can't, and I can't. None of us are good enough. But when God makes his covenant with humanity through Abraham, we've got to respond. And disobedience may cause blessings to be lost. If we don't respond by choice with a lifestyle commitment, we lose out. And as we'll see, we lose the land as well. That's such an important principle. It runs right throughout the Bible. Religion tries to pretend by setting rules for people that we can earn God's blessing in his favor. We can't. And God doesn't want it that way anyway. God takes the initiative to form the relationship with human beings. The beginnings were set in the days of Abraham. Our response is the critical bit. Not us trying to impress God. We can't. You can't and I can't. But responding to what God has done for us. What a fundamental principle there. So at the beginning we could see it's a kind of package deal that God offered Abraham. Abraham responded in obedience. The package deal involved four things: the land, growth of his family, a permanency, and blessings to himself and blessings outward to other people. An everlasting possession. And if you rip that out of context, it means the land belongs to the Jews forever. But it's part of a package deal. The growth of a great nation. The covenant that was made was meant to be permanent. But the aim was it always to bring blessings to others. God blessed Abraham so that Abraham could then bless the nations round about. God blessed the Jews so that they could bring blessing to the peoples round about. We'll look at that further and where they failed and where they succeeded. But it's a complete package deal with conditions attached. I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, says God, and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. We can't earn God's favor, but when God comes to us, we have to take a decision to respond. That was the way with Abraham. Because you have obeyed me. Back to this fundamental biblical principle. We cannot earn God's blessings and we shouldn't try. But disobedience may cause blessings to be lost. There's the picture of the covenant initiated by God, who looks for human response and sets the conditions. Fundamental biblical principles running right throughout the Old Testament, right throughout the New, consistently. It was a kind of package deal. The land, the nation, and blessing those round about. A secure base for life, we all need that. Strength was in numbers, but that was God's ultimate goal, to reach humanity through the people group that would be derived from Abraham. But the conditions: obeying God. Not to win his favor, not to get to heaven, but to receive the blessing of being able to bless others. Now there's an interesting concept that runs throughout the whole of the Bible. To be blessed, to bless others. There's no use having a land if you've not got lots of people. And there's no use having a land if the divine purpose is lost. To bless others, to bless the nations. We'll pick this up in a lot more detail when we look at the Bible passage by passage. But in this overview, I'm going to give time now to catch breath. You may want to move on to the second part, which is on this DVD, or you may want to have a break, a discussion, and come back to part 2 later, where we'll begin to look at what the Old Testament teaches about the Israel-Palestine problem.